The annual fete at Ivy's End had a reputation for being the sort of event in which nothing of consequence had ever happened, and where the most dramatic occurrence was usually a strong breeze, knocking over the trestle table, bearing the tombola prizes. Thus, it came as something of a communal surprise, if not quite a scandal, when the trailing ivy displayed by Mrs. Dorinda Carline chose to expire in public. Mrs. Carline's entry had been positioned directly beneath the bunting at the horticultural tent's entrance, as if to greet visitors with an example of nature obedient to human will. The ivy was indeed impressive, draped from its ceramic urn like the shawl of a well-dressed dowager, its tendrils glossy, disciplined, and perhaps even smug. It had, as several remarked, a way of knowing it would win. When it collapsed, it did so with the quietly theatrical precision of a fainting lady at an Edwardian picnic. A fractional shudder, a settling droop, and then a soft thud as the urn tipped, spilling a modest landslide of potting soil onto the matting. The crowd, comprised mostly of villagers who had attended every fete since the era of ration books, leaned in with far more curiosity than sympathy. "My word," murmured Mrs. Petal, who never allowed a conversation to occur without inserting her judgment. "It's gone and died at the very moment of triumph. A warning, if you ask me." "No one asked you, Petal," replied a voice from behind a pyramid of gooseberry preserves. Inspector Purbright, who had been invited by the fete committee to judge the Victoria Sponge competition, a role he accepted out of politeness and a faint hope of finding a cake less aggressive than last year's, observed the event from several paces away. He had already sampled 6 sponges and was beginning to suspect that the 7th might prove decisive in determining the future of his digestive piece. That the ivy had chosen this precise moment to ramble off life stage offered him a welcome pause. It was the envelope that changed the mood. A corner of white, made conspicuously whiter by its emergence from the dark soil, caught the eyes of several spectators. There followed the kind of communal hush usually reserved for funerals or surprise announcements at parish council meetings. Mrs. Carline, flushing the colour of warmed beetroot, bent to retrieve the thing. "Oh dear," she said, in a tone that seemed equally concerned for the ivy and the public perception of herself. This isn't mine." "It was in your plant," pointed out Mrs. Petal. "Hidden," she added, lest anyone miss the opportunity for melodrama. Purbright stepped forward, more to prevent the situation from acquiring additional layers of gossip than from any investigative zeal at this stage. "Allow me," he said. He accepted the envelope with the air of a man receiving a library book overdue by a polite margin. The handwriting on the front, tidy, slanted, a little old-fashioned, spelled out a name: Mr. Arnold Peckham. A ripple of recognition passed through the older villagers. "But he's been dead for years," whispered the retired postmistress, Mrs. Shillaby. "Heart attack. Or was it gout? Might have been both." Purbright noted the handwriting again. Neat, formal, the sort one might use for official matters or significant personal declarations. He did not open it. "Has anyone any idea how this came to be in Mrs. Carline's ivy?" he asked mildly. The question produced immediate and mutually contradictory answers. Mrs. Carline protested she had purchased the plant only the day before from the Ivy's End community greenhouse. Young Trevor Blee, a teenage volunteer with a hairstyle that defied gravity and lawful taste, claimed he had seen someone hovering suspiciously near the horticulture tent earlier, but could not remember who, only that they wore something brownish. Mr. Cedric Norton, a man who habitually inserted himself into stories to improve their tone, announced that the ivy had clearly been tampered with and that plants don't faint without reason. "It didn't faint," muttered Purbright. He turned the envelope over. No date, no seal, merely a well-folded flap. Whatever secret it held, it had waited long enough. It could wait a little longer. A loud clang interrupted the gathering. The clock above Ivy's End Institute chimed 12. Purbright glanced at his watch. 11:52. Someone remarked, "Ah, that old thing always runs fast," in the tone of a village defending one of its more obscure but cherished eccentricities. Purbright pocketed the envelope gently, as though concerned it might bruise. The crowd exhaled, gossip already fermenting. Before he could leave the tent, Reverend Simeon Wreath appeared, looking flushed and faintly reproachful, as if the ivy's collapse had been engineered specifically to spoil his sermon notes. "Inspector," he said, "I do hope this little kerfuffle won't overshadow the rest of the fete." "Kerfuffles rarely have the courtesy to limit themselves," Purbright replied. Mrs. Carline hovered at his elbow. "Inspector, please, don't let this make people think I had anything to do with it. You know how they talk." Purbright glanced gently toward Mrs. Petal, who had already embarked on an enthusiastic retelling to the jam stall. "Indeed," he said, "they do talk." He made a mental note of the reactions: the overly nervous, the overly helpful, and the overly dismissive. In his experience, truth in small towns tended to hide behind the volume of reaction rather than in its content. As he stepped out into the sunlight, a June breeze rustled the bunting above. The fete went on. Children attempted to throw hoops over wooden ducks. The brass band resumed a march far too energetic for its age, and a dog barked at a scarecrow with ancestral hostility. But Purbright felt, in the subtle shift of village air, the beginning of something, an unsettling undercurrent threading its way beneath Ivy's End's respectable calm. He glanced once more at the envelope in his pocket. Whatever lay inside had already set the village thinking, suspecting, adjusting their stories, and he had not yet opened it. The fete, once restored to its habitual rhythm of raffles and overboiled tea, nonetheless carried beneath its surface a kind of rippling unease, as though Ivy's End itself had taken a shallow collective breath. Inspector Purbright sensed it not by any dramatic change in atmosphere, but through the subtler signs. A certain skittishness in conversation, the faintly watchful glances exchanged among villagers who normally concern themselves with nothing more clandestine than the price of seed potatoes. His attempts to leave the horticultural tent were delayed several times by citizens eager, some too eager, to express their theories about the letter. Mrs. Petal had already expanded the event into a full-blown moral parable, announcing that messages buried in soil never bode well, a statement she applied with equal firmness to gardening, marriage, and church governance. She delivered this pronouncement to a group of women who nodded as though they understood perfectly, though Purbright suspected they understood nothing at all, beyond the promise of a new topic for later embellishment. Others displayed peculiar restraint, which in a village like Ivy's End was even more suspicious than gossip. Reverend Wreath, normally inclined to give gentle pastoral lectures at the slightest provocation, confined himself to a terse, "Let us hope nothing unpleasant comes of it," before briskly reorganizing hymn sheets at the church stall. His movements were precise, almost to the point of agitation. Purbright made a note. The Reverend was not a man who enjoyed disorder, whether moral or horticultural. Councillor Bertram Ede, long-faced, officious, and structurally incapable of ignoring any public commotion, hovered near the tea urn like a crane waiting for an opportune frog. Every time Purbright glanced in his direction, Ide redirected his expression into one of civic concern. Then, thinking himself unobserved, he would glance restlessly about the fete as though someone else's behavior mattered very much to him. A man expecting trouble or fearing recognition often looked that way. And there was Mrs. Carline herself, who alternated between wringing her hands and attempting to act breezily unconcerned. The performance fooled no one. She lingered near groups who mentioned the ivy, drifting closer in the pretense of browsing baked goods, then retreating hastily when someone mentioned her name. The villagers, scenting insecurity like terriers scenting a rabbit, made sure her name was mentioned often. A peculiar incident occurred near the coconut shy. Mr. Burford Snill, a retired solicitor known chiefly for his insistence that every gathering needed minutes taken, approached Purbright with an odd air of solemnity. He adjusted his spectacles, leaned in, and whispered, "Inspector, I believe that letter is part of something rather arcane." Purbright blinked. "Arcane, Mr. Snill?" "Yes, signs, portents." Snill's voice dropped further. "Ivy has long associations with dark omens." The inspector reflected that ivy, in his own experience, had more associations with clogged gutters and collapsing sheds, but he refrained from comment. Snill continued, clearly pleased to be the sole authority of something. In the 17th century, ivy was thought to conceal hidden evils. You may recall the old rhyme, "When ivy droops and shadows bend." Purbright spared him the need to finish. "Trouble stalks the village end." "Yes, I have heard a version." Snill nodded gravely, as though they were discussing classified intelligence. "Be vigilant, Inspector. These things are seldom coincidences." Purbright thanked him with impeccable courtesy. Although he privately attributed the solicitor's concerns to a fatal combination of boredom and an overindulgence in historical pamphlets. But the peculiar behaviour did not end with superstitions. Young Trevor Blee, still loitering around the horticulture tent, seemed torn between wanting to speak again and wanting very much not to. Whenever Purbright approached, Trevor brightened with eagerness, only to retreat mid-sentence with a sudden, inexplicable shyness. Something in the boy's manner suggested he had discovered more than he understood, or perhaps more than he wished to admit. Equally telling was the behaviour of Mrs. Shillaby, the retired postmistress whose memory for handwriting bordered on the forensic. She had earlier insisted that the script on the envelope looked dangerously familiar, yet now avoided the subject entirely. When Purbright gently inquired whether she had recalled anything further, she responded with suspiciously elaborate descriptions of her current knitting project, including the number of stitches per row. The fate's atmosphere shifted further when the Institute clock chimed again, this time sounding only 3 minutes ahead of Purbright's watch. Several villagers frowned at the discrepancy, though none said so aloud. It was, he noted, an example of the village's instinct to protect its own mythologies. If the clock had always been 8 minutes fast, it ought to remain 8 minutes fast. Change, even inaccuracy corrected, was unsettling. A brief but telling encounter occurred at the table displaying local honey. Mr. Arnold Glegg, the village's resident beekeeper, was attempting to appear cheerful behind his jars, but the strain showed in his thinning smile. "Afternoon, Inspector," he said, rather too quickly. "Fine day for it." "Very fine," Purbright replied. "Your hive's doing well?" "Oh, splendidly, splendid." Glegg shifted from one foot to the other. "Nothing unusual. Not a thing." Purbright had not asked about unusual things. Another curiosity arose when Miss Blythe, the choir mistress, a firm, angular woman with a habit of speaking as if addressing an invisible congregation, spilled an entire basket of raffle tickets upon hearing a rumour that the envelope was written shortly before the late Mr. Peckham's death. She denied knowing the clerk personally, but her hands trembled as she gathered the tickets, and she refused to meet Purbright's eye. The inspector walked the fete with the patient observation of a man strolling through a gallery where the paintings were continually rearranging themselves. Villagers who normally exchanged harmless barbs were uncharacteristically polite. Others, normally conversational fountains, had become tight-lipped. Even the children seemed unusually subdued, glancing toward the horticultural tent with the fascinated dread usually reserved for funerary flowers. The envelope, without being opened, had already unsettled the village's internal geometry. People aligned themselves differently. Some hid behind friendliness, others behind indifference, a few behind silence. As he paused beside the bookstall, Purbright allowed himself a moment's reflection. He had not yet read the letter, but its impact was already evident in the delicate readjustments of human behaviour around him. In Ivy's End, secrets rarely stayed buried. They merely changed shape, like ivy tendrils seeking new stone to cling to. And this particular secret, he suspected, had begun to loosen several stones at once. Inspector Purbright began his inquiries in the gentle, almost domestic fashion that Ivy's End had come to regard as his particular hallmark. He approached conversations as though borrowing sugar rather than probing for truth. Yet, beneath his courteous tone, every hesitation, half-formed remark, and misplaced smile was carefully collected. His first stop was Mrs. Dorinda Carline, who stood at the edge of the fete with the air of someone expecting to be approached and yet dreading it. She clutched her handbag as if it were a shield. "I'm afraid," she began before Purbright said a word, "this entire business is becoming exaggerated beyond reason." Purbright nodded agreeably. "The villagers do enjoy a story." "It isn't a story," she insisted. "Not one of mine, anyway. I bought that ivy yesterday. I told you." "From the community greenhouse," Purbright prompted gently. "Did you choose it yourself?" "Well, not entirely." She looked away. "I'd asked someone to set aside a strong plant for me. A friend. I'm sure it was just a coincidence, Inspector. The envelope must have been, what's the phrase, accidentally included." "Of course," Purbright said. "Whose care was the plant in before you collected it?" Mrs. Carline hesitated. Too long. "Councillor Ide has the keys, but he always does, for all official village things." Purbright thanked her and moved on without pressing. Her relief was palpable. Next he found Mrs. Shillaby, the retired postmistress, perched at a table of handmade knitted owls. She attempted cheeriness with all the conviction of a woman trying to distract a cat from the canary behind her. "You mentioned earlier," Purbright began, "that the handwriting on the envelope seemed familiar." "Oh, did I?" She laughed too brightly. "My memory isn't what it was, Inspector. Knitting helps, calms the mind." Purbright examined the knitted owl, nodding appreciatively. "I imagine you handled quite a volume of correspondence in your time." "Thousands," she said, with the faint pride of someone recalling a bygone competence. "Of course, some letters were more personal than others, some more secretive." "And the one in the ivy?" Her needles paused, the rhythm breaking like a mis-struck chord. "Well, the slant of the letters. It reminded me of something from years ago, but there were many hands like that. Officials, clerks, men who wanted to appear tidy. Would Arnold Peckham have written in such a style?" She inhaled sharply, almost inaudibly. Possibly. I couldn't say with certainty. But you thought of him, Purbright said, lightly, as though discussing the weather. Mrs. Shillaby resumed knitting with renewed vigour. It's only natural that one thinks of the name on the envelope. Yes, Purbright agreed. Natural. Trevor Blee required no invitation. The youth bounded over like an enthusiastic spaniel. I remembered something, he announced before Purbright could speak. About the plant. Purbright smiled. Go on. Well, earlier today, this morning I mean, I was in the greenhouse helping set up the displays, and that ivy wasn't in the place Mrs. Carline said she'd left it. I'm sure of it. It was on the far bench, near the back. Was anyone else in the greenhouse at the time? Trevor frowned. I thought I saw someone leaving just as I went in. Someone wearing a brown coat. Could have been Mrs. Petal, or Councillor Ide, or that handyman chap who fixes things around here. Hard to tell. Purbright thanked him, though Trevor lingered, clearly wanting to add more but unable to articulate it. Eventually, the boy drifted off, looking troubled. The inspector made his way toward the honey stall. Mr. Glegg, the beekeeper, stiffened as he approached. Good afternoon again, Purbright said. Your hives didn't give you any trouble last night, did they? Glegg blinked as though struck. Why do you ask? You seemed anxious earlier. I wasn't anxious, Glegg said too quickly. Just tired. Bees keep a man busy, always buzzing, never resting. I imagine strange things become apparent if you spend enough time observing them. Glegg swallowed. I wouldn't know. Nothing strange here, Inspector. Not with the hives. Not with anything. Which, Purbright thought, was an extraordinary way to phrase a denial. He left the beekeeper and strolled toward the bookstall, where Miss Blythe was arranging hymnals with almost military precision. Miss Blythe, he said politely, I hope the excitement hasn't disturbed your preparations for tomorrow's service. She flinched at the word excitement. These things unsettle people unnecessarily, she replied. A letter in a plant, really. The community loves its dramas. You seemed concerned earlier, Purbright noted, when someone mentioned Mr. Peckham. Did I? She pressed her lips together. I merely dislike incorrect speculation. Mr. Peckham was an unremarkable man. Some would say, Purbright murmured, that unremarkable men often leave the most interesting traces. Her eyes narrowed, but she offered nothing more. Finally, Purbright approached Councillor Ede, who had made several conspicuous circuits around the Fed without engaging in any actual activity. Ide attempted a look of civic stability. Inspector, he said, I do hope this business is resolved quickly. It looks bad, you know, for the village. Of course, Purbright replied. Mrs. Carline mentioned you had access to the greenhouse. I have keys for many village properties. Comes with being responsible. Were you there yesterday? Well, yes, but only briefly, ensuring everything was secure before today. Purbright nodded. Did you see Mrs. Carline's ivy? I didn't examine every pot. Ide laughed awkwardly. Plants all look the same to me. And no envelope caught your eye? I hardly go rummaging in soil, he snapped, then tried to soften it with a smile. Surely you don't suspect anything untoward? Not at all, Purbright said pleasantly, just clarifying the day's events. But as he walked away, he had the impression that Ade very much feared he might suspect something. Something that had not yet been revealed, even to himself. The Fed continued in its cheerful imitation of normalcy, but Purbright sensed the pattern forming. Contradictions Omissions and curious evasions accumulated like the faint beginnings of ivy roots seeking cracks. And somewhere among these polite conversations lay the first thread he intended to follow. Purbright had barely finished his circuit of the fete when the village provided him with something it excelled at, a suspect far too readily agreed upon. It began, as such matters often did, with Councillor Bertram Ede, clearing his throat in a manner that suggested an impending announcement. He mounted the small wooden step beside the refreshments tent, brushing crumbs from his jacket as though preparing for a civic declaration. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, projecting his voice with pompous authority, "there is no need for alarm regarding the unfortunate incident involving Mrs. Carline's ivy." The villagers, who had not been alarmed so much as intrigued, turned their attention toward him with eager expectation. "It is my firm belief," Ide continued, "that this business with the letter is nothing more than a regrettable attempt by Mrs. Carline herself to revive old grievances." A low murmur of excitement passed through the crowd. Mrs. Petal gasped in triumph, as though she had always suspected Mrs. Carline of nefarious horticultural motives. Mrs. Carline, who had been attempting to melt inconspicuously into the shade of the tombola stall, straightened with a look of indignation. "I beg your pardon, Councillor Ide. I have done nothing of the sort." Purbright positioned himself quietly near the group, saying nothing for the moment. Ide's eagerness was already telling its own story. "I mean no unkindness," Ide said, in a tone designed to imply precisely the opposite. "But it is well known that Mrs. Carline and I have had certain disagreements regarding the use of the allotments. I suspect today's little drama may have been intended to cast aspersions upon my management." "How theatrical," murmured Purbright under his breath. The villagers swivelled between the councillor and Mrs. Carline with relish. Someone muttered, "Well, she always did resent him getting first choice of greenhouse spots." Another chimed in, "And didn't she complain about his compost?" "That compost was an abomination," Mrs. Carline protested. Ide lifted his chin. "There you have it. Motive." Purbright stepped forward at last, his voice mild. "An interesting theory, Councillor. Do you have evidence to support it?" Ide seized the question eagerly. The envelope was found in her ivy, her plant, her responsibility. "Indeed," Purbright acknowledged, "though that fact alone hardly proves authorship." "But she bought the plant yesterday," Ide insisted. "Plenty of time to hide something inside it." Mrs. Carline flushed furiously. "The plant was in the greenhouse until this morning, and you were there last night, Councillor. You admitted as much." A new silence fell, one thick with shifting allegiances. Purbright observed Ide's reaction with polite curiosity. The councillor opened and closed his mouth twice before producing a strained smile. "Routine checks, Mrs. Carline. Nothing more." "Routine?" she shot back. "At 9 o'clock at night?" Several villagers tittered. Ide stiffened, his face acquiring a dull red hue. Purbright interjected before the exchange escalated. "Councillor, you believe Mrs. Carline staged this incident to embarrass you over an allotment matter?" "Yes," Ide said, though now with slightly diminished enthusiasm. "She was furious I declined her request for an additional plot. And let us not forget the greenhouse rota dispute." Mrs. Carline folded her arms. "Your rota was absurd. You gave yourself the warmest corner and everyone else the drafty sides. That is a misrepresentation." "It is not." "Perhaps," Purbright suggested gently, "you could both refrain from discussing horticultural arrangements for the moment." They fell silent, though their expressions continued the argument. The villagers, sensing a lull, leaned in closer. Mrs. Petal, now beside Purbright, whispered, "I told you there'd be something behind it. She's always been dramatic, you know." The inspector resisted the temptation to ask who, precisely, had ever known Mrs. Carline to be dramatic. Trevor Blee, lurking at the edge of the gathering, looked as though he wanted to speak again, perhaps to defend Mrs. Carline, but his nerve failed him when Ide cast a stern glance in his direction. Purbright returned his attention to the counsellor. "Tell me, Counsellor Ide, did you handle any of the plants last night during your visit?" "Of course not," Ide said quickly. "Did you move any displays? Rearrange anything?" "I may have straightened a few labels," Ide admitted, "for neatness." "Did you notice the ivy?" "I didn't examine it." Ide shifted uncomfortably. "I was occupied." "With what?" "Ensuring no one had left the tap dripping. Someone always does." "Ah," Purbright said, as though the matter were perfectly clear. He turned to Mrs. Carline. "You collected the plant this morning?" "That's right," she said. "It was on the second bench, left side, exactly where I expected it." Trevor's expression suggested otherwise, but he said nothing. Purbright regarded the crowd, sensing their collective willingness to accept Ide's accusation simply because it offered a tidy explanation. Villagers enjoyed tidy explanations. They were like neatly trimmed hedges, comforting, even if they concealed a few thorns. "Counsellor," Purbright said, "your theory hinges on motive. Do you genuinely believe Mrs. Carline would jeopardize her chances of winning the Ivy competition simply to annoy you?" Ide faltered. "She can be very determined." "And," Purbright continued calmly, "do you believe she would place a letter addressed to a deceased clerk, a letter whose origin she could not possibly explain, in her own entry?" "Well," Ide's confidence sagged, "it seems plausible." Purbright offered him a gentle, almost sympathetic smile. "Plausible, yes. Convenient, certainly. But I wonder if it's a little too convenient." A soft rustle of shifting opinion moved through the crowd. Mrs. Petal frowned, reconsidering. Someone muttered, "He's right, you know." Another whispered, "Ide does protest too much." Ide stiffened, clearly unhappy to feel suspicion drifting toward him. "Are you suggesting I had anything to do with it?" Purbright raised a placating hand. "Not at all. I suggest only that we refrain from assigning blame prematurely." He glanced toward the greenhouse in the distance, its glass panes catching the afternoon light like quiet witnesses. "There are several matters yet unclear," he added, "and the most obvious explanation is not always the truest." Counsellor Ide swallowed, his composure faltering for a moment, and Purbright noted it with interest. The village would cling to a convenient suspect for as long as allowed, but he had no intention of making this mystery so simple. The confrontation between Counsellor Ide and Mrs. Carline did little to dispel the air of uncertainty that hung over the fate. If anything, it deepened it. The villagers dispersed not with relief, but with that peculiar restlessness that arises when a tidy answer is offered and quietly doubted. Purbright sensed it in their backward glances, their unfinished sentences, and the way small groups reformed to compare impressions like amateur sleuths. He, however, turned his attention toward a detail that had tugged gently at his mind since the ivy first collapsed. The clock above Ivy's End Institute. It loomed at the far end of the green, its face catching the afternoon light, hands fixed in their usual posture of mild superiority over village timekeeping. It had chimed 12 earlier than Purbright's watch had permitted, 8 minutes early by his calculation. And yet, more recently, it had chimed only 3 minutes ahead. A fickle piece of machinery, or a truthful one moment and dishonest the next. He strolled toward the institute with the casual air of a man stretching his legs. A few villagers watched him go, pretending not to. Mrs. Petal whispered something conspiratorial to a friend, no doubt constructing a theory involving spectral intervention or horticultural vengeance. Reaching the clock tower's base, Purbright paused. The institute was quiet, its doors closed for the afternoon, except for a side entrance propped open with a stack of folded chairs. He considered the clock face above, stately, slightly tarnished, a relic of a more ambitious era in which villages built public buildings with grandness they couldn't entirely justify. Inside the institute, the air was cooler and smelled faintly of floor polish and hymn books. Purbright followed the corridor to the small maintenance room beneath the tower. A sign on the door read, "Authorized personnel only," which in Ivy's End generally meant anyone with curiosity and an ability to feign authority. He knocked lightly, more out of courtesy than expectation. No reply. He stepped inside. The room was cramped, a table stacked with paint tins, a collection of elderly tools, and, at its center, a wooden ladder leading up into the narrow tower where the clock's mechanism resided. The faint ticking above was irregular, like a heartbeat under strain. Purbright climbed carefully. At the top of the ladder, he found the large brass gears of the village clock exposed in a small chamber lit by a dusty window. It was an old mechanism, the kind that required weekly winding and occasional coaxing, of a responsibility usually shared among volunteers, none of whom were particularly reliable in matters of precision. But what caught his attention was the small lever at the base of the regulating pendulum. It was set slightly off-center. Someone had adjusted the clock. Not long ago either. Dust displaced. The faint smell of oil. A small fingerprint. Purbright leaned closer. The adjustment was subtle, the kind of change that would gradually shift the time by minutes rather than hours. A methodical hand had been at work, not careless mischief. Below, footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor. The inspector waited, listening. Someone passed by, then retreated. He climbed down the ladder and stepped quietly back into the hallway. Outside on the green, Councillor Ide was now fervently discussing the matter with two other villagers, gesturing frequently toward the greenhouse, as though desperate to redirect attention there. Purbright noted the councillor's unease, but moved on without engaging. What mattered at that moment was time. More precisely, the manipulation of time. The villagers, when asked, had insisted the clock always ran fast. They had said it with that emphatic certainty small communities develop around their shared untruths. Traditions were easier embraced than examined. Even inaccuracies, when consistent, became comforting. But the clock had not always been fast today. It had changed its behavior within the span of the fate. Purbright resumed his slow walk across the green, observing everything with a calm, detached interest. Children chased each other around the coconut shy. Mrs. Shillaby knitted with determined ferocity, each stitch a barrier against unwelcome recollection. Mr. Glegg the beekeeper had vanished entirely, leaving his jars of honey attended only by a polite cardboard sign. Miss Blythe rearranged raffle prizes with the solemnity of a woman preparing for an inquest, and Trevor Blee lurked behind the gazebo, wrestling with indecision about approaching the inspector again. Purbright's gaze drifted back to the clock face. The hands now showed a time that matched his watch to the minute. Someone had corrected it. It was an interesting choice. If the clock's traditional fastness had formed part of the village's familiar backdrop, then its sudden accuracy would unsettle them, though few might be able to articulate why. A shift in a village's long-accepted quirk was not trivial. It suggested someone cared about time in a very specific way, and someone had needed time to appear differently than it was. The Ivy incident had been timed to the Fates' transition between competitions. The envelope had emerged at a moment when the maximum number of onlookers were present. Though Purbright doubted this had been intentional, the collapse seemed too natural, too accidental. Yet the presence of the letter in the plant, that was deliberate. He walked back toward the horticultural tent. The overturned urn still lay on its side, where Mrs. Carline had abandoned it, though now the soil had been swept neatly into a pile by someone conscientious. Purbright crouched, tracing the faint impression of the pot in the matting. Around it, faint scuff marks told a quiet story. The plant had been moved at least twice before the collapse. The positions overlapped imperfectly, indicating small adjustments. Perhaps the result of a switch. Perhaps something else. As he stood, the Institute clock chimed the half-hour, perfectly on time. Purbright smiled, barely perceptible. The village might offer him convenient suspects and convenient stories, but clocks could not lie, not unless someone encouraged them. And whoever had touched the clock had touched the truth as well, however lightly. The Fed's energy had begun to thin by late afternoon, drifting into that languid stage where the scent of trampled grass mingled with cooling tea and the stalls sagged slightly from exertion. Yet beneath this settling calm, Purbright sensed the widening of the mystery as surely as a spider feels movement along its web. Threads were pulling from directions he had not yet examined, and the time-shifted clock had only sharpened his awareness that more lay beneath Ivy's end's respectful surface. His first new thread appeared in the form of Miss Lavinia Blythe's sister, Margaret, who materialized beside the bookstall carrying a stack of hymnals so high they obscured her face. She set them down with a sigh born of long practice. "Oh, Inspector," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "Lavinia tells me you've been asking about that dreadful letter." Purbright inclined his head, just clarifying a few matters. "Well," Margaret continued, lowering her voice as though confiding state secrets, "I do hope you realize that Lavinia had nothing to do with it." "I hadn't considered she might," Purbright replied politely. "Good, because she takes Mr. Peckham's memory very seriously." Purbright allowed a small pause. "Did she know him well?" Margaret hesitated, her eyes flicking to her sister's rigid posture across the green. She would never admit it, but yes, he was a regular at choir rehearsals. Not a singer, mind. He tuned the piano. They talked often. She said he was a kind soul and misunderstood. Misunderstood in what way? Oh, all sorts. He worried too much about council matters. Spoke of things being misplaced or misfiled. I never quite understood. She looked at Purbright meaningfully. People forget that he died rather suddenly. And do they forget? Purbright asked gently. Or prefer to forget? Margaret's silence answered for her. He thanked her and moved along the green, only to encounter Mr. Glegg re-emerging from behind the gazebo, wiping his hands on a handkerchief with exaggerated care. His earlier evasiveness now had company. Guilt, or at least the village's version of it. A nervous eagerness to appear useful. "Inspector," he called, forcing brightness. "I was just checking on the honey supplies." Purbright nodded. A noble task. Glegg swallowed. "You don't think, that is, none of this business touches on me, does it?" "Why would it?" Purbright asked mildly. "Well, the hives were disturbed last night. Not badly. Just shifted. I thought it was foxes, or boys. Mischief, you know." "Anything taken?" No, just movement. He dabbed his forehead. But I can't imagine how that connects to a letter in an ivy pot. Nor can I, Purbright said. Not yet. The beekeeper blinked at the implication hidden in the last words. Further along, near the craft stall, two women, Mrs. Trenwith and her cousin Florrie, were deep in discussion. Their voices carried with the clarity of those who considered eavesdropping a natural right. Told you he was paid in cash, Florrie was saying. Didn't trust the banks after that business in '72. Still, Mrs. Trenwith replied, taking money to move plants is hardly criminal. That's not what he said, Florrie exclaimed. He said he was paid not to ask questions. Purbright approached with a courteous, "Ladies," and the conversation leapt instantly to a halt. Florrie coloured. "We were only talking, Inspector. As is the village's prerogative," he said. "Who was paid, may I ask?" Florrie exchanged a glance with her cousin before whispering, "Mr. Bantle, the handyman. He said someone paid him last night to help carry several pots from the greenhouse to the back door. Cash up front. No name given." "Did he recognize the person?" "Oh no," Mrs. Trenwith said quickly. "He said the man kept his coat collar turned up. But Bantle noticed his shoes, good ones, leather, not the type a handyman would wear." "A man concerned with not being seen," Purbright murmured, "and not used to manual work." Florrie nodded vigorously. "Exactly. And Bantle said the ivy he moved was a big one, heavy, like Mrs. Carline's." Purbright thanked them, leaving them glowing with the satisfaction of having contributed to something important. Next, he found Reverend Reith at the church stall, fussing with a stack of pamphlets that had been perfectly aligned moments earlier. The Reverend looked relieved for the distraction of Purbright's arrival. "Inspector, I do hope this unfortunate business isn't distracting people from the charitable purpose of this event." "I believe the village is capable of multitasking," Purbright said, "though I wonder if you noticed anything unusual this morning." Reverend Reith hesitated. "Well, I did see someone near the Institute early today, around 7, a man in a brown coat." "Brown seems to be the fashion for anonymity," Purbright noted. "Did you recognize him?" "No. He walked away quickly when he saw me." The Reverend's voice dropped. "Toward the clock tower." Purbright absorbed this quietly. The clock, the greenhouse, the ivy, the unnamed man in the brown coat. Pieces forming the outline of a puzzle still lacking its key. He made his way once more toward Trevor Blee, who appeared to have been wrestling all afternoon with his conscience and losing. The boy spotted him approaching and straightened abruptly. "Inspector," he said, voice unsteady, "I think I remembered something else." "Take your time," Purbright encouraged. Trevor swallowed. "When I saw the plant this morning, before I realized it had been moved, there was dirt on the floor, fresh dirt, and a footprint, small, smaller than Councillor Ide's anyway." "Could it have been Mrs. Carline's?" Purbright asked. Trevor shook his head. "These had a different tread, more like office shoes." "Office shoes," Purbright repeated. Trevor nodded. "My dad has some, worn smooth on the sides. These look like that." Another thread, another direction. Purbright thanked the boy, who exhaled with enormous relief. He walked back toward the green centre, absorbing the new information as easily as breathing. A choir mistress with a hidden attachment to a deceased clerk. A beekeeper anxious about disturbed hives. A handyman hired in secret by someone wealthy enough to avoid manual labour. A man in a brown coat moving between the greenhouse and the clock tower at dawn, and all of it orbiting a single collapsed ivy. Purbright looked again at the Institute clock, which now displayed its time with irritating correctness. From the green below, it presided over the village like a witness too polite to speak unless directly addressed. He would address it soon enough. But first, he thought, the story behind the letter was widening, and the people who feared its contents were beginning slowly to show their edges. The late afternoon sun had begun its slow descent when Purbright returned briefly to the Fed's temporary police table, a modest affair consisting of a folding chair, a ledger, and a tin marked lost property. He intended only to check that the envelope, still unopened, remained safely where he had placed it earlier. The sight that greeted him was not alarming at first glance, merely an officer chatting amiably with a resident. But as he approached, a faint wrongness made itself felt. The ledger lay open, the tin nudged slightly askew, and the small wooden box where the envelope had been stored now sat with its lid open like a yawn of surprise. The envelope was gone. Purbright paused, allowing the scene's quiet disorder to settle before he spoke. Constable Horsley, a well-meaning young man whose enthusiasm for village events far exceeded his aptitude for supervision, turned with a cheeriness that evaporated instantly at the inspector's expression. "Sir, I was just—" "Indeed," Purbright said, surveying the table with the calm of a man inspecting the aftermath of a minor but telling storm. "How long have you been away from this post?" "Only a minute or two," Horsley said quickly. "Mrs. Trenwith wanted me to look at her lost spectacles. They were on her hat, sir." "Ah," the constable swallowed. Is something missing?" Purbright lifted the lid of the empty box. "It appears our letter has grown restless." Horsley paled. I didn't see anyone near the table. Truly, sir, I was only steps away." "Items tend not to sprout legs in one's absence," Purbright said gently, "but they do often sprout hands." Before the constable could fumble an apology, Purbright noticed a small object on the corner of the table. A single ivy leaf, crushed, its veins darkened, and its edges curled. It looked deliberately placed. He did not touch it, merely observed. The leaf belonged to the same variety as Mrs. Carline's ivy, though that hardly narrowed matters. Ivy grew in abundance across Ivy's End, as though determined to justify the village's name. "Did you see anyone lingering?" Purbright asked. Horsley shook his head miserably. "Just the usual crowd, sir. People coming and going. Nothing suspicious." Nothing suspicious, Purbright thought, was often the most suspicious thing of all. He pocketed the crushed leaf carefully in an envelope of his own, then closed the empty box. His mind moved with quiet precision. Someone had been desperate enough to take the letter before he opened it, desperate enough to risk being seen, to act in broad daylight, and to leave behind a token that might be clue or taunt. As he stepped back, a voice called from across the green. It was Reverend Reith, trotting toward him with the determined haste of a man accustomed to moving only at necessary moments. "Inspector, a word if I may." Purbright nodded. "Of course." The Reverend glanced nervously toward the Fate's dwindling crowds, then lowered his voice. "There is something you should know. I did not mention it earlier because I wasn't certain, but now, well, now I believe I am." "Please," Purbright encouraged. "This morning," Reith said, adjusting his clerical collar, "I was out early preparing the parish tent when I saw a figure climbing the steps to the Institute clock tower." Purbright's attention sharpened. "Climbing? At what time?" "Just after 6. Perhaps a few minutes before." The Reverend paused. "I assumed it was someone authorized to reset the clock, but the more I think on it, the less certain I become." "Did Did you recognize him? No, Reith admitted. His coat was brown, and he kept his head down, but he moved quickly as though time were pressing. Purbright offered a small nod. And you didn't see him descend? No. When I looked again, he was gone. A man in a brown coat, the same description Trevor Blee had offered, the same noted by Mrs. Carline. Brown, it seemed, was the camouflage of choice for those wishing to blend into Ivy's End's palette of decent mediocrity. The inspector thanked the Reverend, then resumed his slow walk across the green. The fete was winding down fully now. Children carried half-deflated balloons, stalls were being dismantled, and the brass band attempted a final march that staggered towards silence. Yet the mood had shifted again. The disappearance of the letter spread through the villagers like a draught through a church aisle. Subtle at first, then crispening their whispers. Mrs. Petal announced loudly that she had said from the beginning the affair was unnatural. Others speculated about burglars, spies, political saboteurs, and, according to Mrs. Snill, vengeful spirits. But amidst the noise, Purbright noticed something far more telling. Councillor Ide looked stricken. Not theatrical, not indignant, genuinely stricken. His gaze flicked repeatedly toward the police table, then away, as though afraid to be caught looking. When Purbright moved in his direction, Ide retreated toward the cake tent, muttering something about assisting with clean-up. This, Purbright thought, was interesting. Ide had accused Mrs. Carline with almost indecent eagerness. Now, when the letter vanished, his composure faltered. Coincidence? Possibly. But Purbright placed little faith in coincidence when paired with nervous perspiration. Drawing closer to the institute again, he noticed a thin trail of soil near the side entrance, faint but distinct. A smudge here, a crumb of earth there. Recent. Someone had passed through carrying something from the fete. Perhaps a stolen envelope. Perhaps the ivy leaf now resting in his pocket. He followed the trail only a short distance before it disappeared into the trampled grass. Not unexpected, but the direction mattered. It led toward the clock tower. Inside the institute, the door to the maintenance room was closed now, and the corridor held the damp quiet of a building no longer populated by villagers. Purbright stood a moment, then stepped back into the evening light. Another villager approached him, Miss Blythe, cheeks flushed and expression rigid. "Inspector," she said, voice taut, "I feel it my duty to tell you something." Purbright inclined his head. "I saw someone near the clock tower not long after Reverend Reith's sighting, just before the fete began. He was walking briskly. I couldn't see his face, but..." Her throat tightened. "He wore a brown coat." A third confirmation. "And there is something more," she added reluctantly. "He carried a small tin box." "What kind of box?" Purbright asked softly. "Metal. Old. Like one used for keeping important things." Purbright thanked her, and Miss Blythe fled with the look of one who feared having said too much. He turned once more toward the clock tower, its face now shining pale gold in the lowering sun. It ticked with serene indifference, but Purbright heard something else beneath the mechanical rhythm. A tightening of threads, a drawing together of secrets. The letter's disappearance was not a new mystery, but the return of an old one. One that certain people in Ivy's End had hoped would remain buried under ivy and time. And now the person most threatened by its contents had shown themselves not through confession, but through the simple, undeniable act of fear. Evening drifted over Ivy's End with the slow inevitability of a curtain being drawn. softening the edges of the fate's remnants until the green looked like the aftermath of some mild, well-mannered tempest. Chairs were stacked, paper cups abandoned, bunting stirring faintly as though tired of its own cheerfulness. Purbright walked the perimeter in unhurried steps, allowing the village's shifting silences to settle around him. There were always two kinds of quiet in a place like Ivy's End: the ordinary quiet of closing hours and the watchful quiet that follows when too many people are thinking too quickly about the same thing. The second now pressed gently on the streets, like a hand smoothing over ripples that refused to disappear. Purbright paused beneath a lamppost listening, not to sounds, but to absences. Somewhere behind the rows of cottages came the faint click of a latch hastily shut. From another garden, the murmur of two neighbours discussing matters they had no intention of reporting accurately. Beyond that, doors closed, curtains twitched, lights flickered on and off, with a restlessness that betrayed uneasy minds. The inspector had learned long ago that small towns did not fear crime itself. What they feared was what crime might reveal. A theft was never just a theft. It was a disturbance of the familiar arrangement of things, a subtle suggestion that someone they had misjudged or trusted or quietly disliked might suddenly need to be re-evaluated. No village liked re-evaluations. No village welcomed the prospect of looking at its own reflection from a new, less flattering angle. The stolen letter, then, had become a catalyst, not merely a missing item. It had pried open memories, reopened half-forgotten disputes, and stirred a collection of anxieties that had evidently been fermenting long before Purbright set foot at the fete. He examined the crushed ivy leaf he had retrieved from the police table, now resting in the envelope inside his pocket. A curious token to leave behind, too deliberate, too poised, almost theatrical. Someone had been frightened enough to steal the letter, yet confident enough to mark their act with a botanical signature. Fear mixed with pride, perhaps, or fear mixed with ritual. Ivy's End possessed a long memory for petty symbolism. Someone had counted on that. What troubled Purbright most was not the theft itself, but the urgency behind it. Whoever acted had known they could not wait. They had known the letter carried something dangerous, dangerous enough that even ignorance was preferable to its being in police hands. But they had also known that destroying the letter outright might raise further suspicion. The half measure of a hasty theft hinted at panic, not calculation. He wandered toward the institute, where the clock face glowed pale in the last light. It ticked solemnly, as though unaware of how deeply implicated it had become. Purbright watched its hands move with steady conviction. A thing that had lied all day had now returned to telling the truth. Or perhaps it was lying more skillfully. Time in small communities was always elastic. People recalled things in ways that suited them. A meeting took place earlier or later depending on the moral convenience of the speaker. An argument happened only yesterday or ages ago, according to who wished sympathy. A secret had never existed until it resurfaced inconveniently. Ivy's End's clock had simply expressed, in metal and gears, the same human inclination, to shift truth minutely, steadily, until everyone accepted the new alignment without noticing how it had changed. Purbright thought of Reverend Reith's sighting of the early morning figure, of Trevor Blee's footprint near the greenhouse, of Miss Blythe's recollection of the tin box, of Mr. Bantle's anonymous employer in the brown coat, of Councillor Ide's poorly concealed anxiety, a village full of quiet rearrangements, of pots, of alibis, of memories, of time itself. He considered human nature with the detached sympathy that had long guided him. People hid things not always out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of embarrassment, fear of consequence, fear of being known too well. Secrets were often the offspring of small cowardices, rather than great wickedness. Yet the trouble with secrets was that they accumulated layer by layer, until even their keepers no longer remembered which part of the story had once been true. Arnold Peckham had been a quiet man, by all accounts, tidy, dutiful, perhaps overlooked. Such people often saw more than anyone realized. They remembered irregularities, noticed misfiled documents, overheard stray remarks. They were the kind of people who became repositories of truths others preferred forgotten. A hidden letter addressed to a dead clerk suggested unfinished business, unfinished for someone still alive. Purbright's reflection was not melancholy. Rather, it possessed a gentle inevitability. Human behavior, after all, had never required grand motives to produce elaborate consequences. A minor grievance, a pocketed debt, a bruised reputation. Any could be enough to send someone fumbling in panic toward a clock tower at dawn, or slipping an ivy leaf onto a table as a trembling mark of defiance. He turned back toward the village green, where only a few figures now lingered. Councillor Ede paced near the cake tent, pretending to help dismantle it, but actually watching the inspector. Mrs. Carline sat rigidly on a bench, twisting the strap of her handbag. Miss Blythe strode briskly toward home, with a posture stiffened by secrets she clearly wished she did not know. Mr. Glegg disappeared down a side lane with the haste of someone eager to outrun his own thoughts. Purbright regarded them with quiet compassion. Not adversaries, he thought, not villains, just people entangled in a web they had woven long before today. A web woven with pride, guilt, small lies, and the inexorable creeping nature of ivy, beautiful in sunshine, treacherous in shadow. And beneath all of it, a simple truth continued to shift, just out of reach, but growing clearer with each passing minute, much like a clock finally settling into the correct time. Morning in Ivy's End arrived with a brightness that felt almost inappropriate for a village nursing so many half-suppressed anxieties. The Fate Green, now empty of its tents and tables, looked strangely bare, as though the previous day's commotion had been a dream the village preferred not to recall too clearly. But memories lingered in the air, uneasy, unsettled, waiting. Purbright walked the green with the same unhurried manner as always, hands clasped behind his back, gaze drifting from the church spire to the institute clock. It had kept perfect time overnight. Too perfect, he thought. A reformed sinner often behaved with suspicious zeal. He had no intention of confronting anyone loudly or publicly. That was not how Ivy's End yielded its truths. Instead, he had arranged for several villagers, those closest to the affair, to gather inside the Institute Hall, under the polite pretext of clarifying yesterday's sequence of events. No one refused. Refusal itself would have appeared conspicuous, and in Ivy's End, conspicuousness was a social misstep akin to treason. When Purbright entered the hall, he found them waiting with varying degrees of discomfort. Mrs. Carline perched stiffly on a folding chair, looking both hopeful and terrified. Councillor Ide stood near the window, pretending to examine the view. Reverend Reith fussed with hymn leaflets he had brought for no logical reason. Miss Blythe and her sister sat side by side, hands folded neatly, as though preparing for a moral inquiry. Mr. Glegg, the beekeeper, hovered near the back like a man wishing he were elsewhere but afraid to leave. Trevor Blee arrived last. Clutching a notebook, he clearly hoped Purbright wouldn't ask to see. The Institute Hall's clock, smaller cousin to the tower's, hung above the front table. Purbright noted that it, too, showed the correct time. He doubted this was coincidence. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "I appreciate your willingness to assist. I hope to simply clarify the order of events leading to the discovery of the letter." Several pairs of eyes flicked toward Councillor Ide, who stiffened. Purbright continued, "If I may ask each of you to indicate where you were when Mrs. Carline's ivy, shall we say, expressed its distress." A faint ripple of awkward amusement moved through the group. He motioned gently for them to spread around the room in positions approximating their places near the horticultural tent. They obliged with varying degrees of self-consciousness. Mrs. Carline stood beside an imagined display table. Reverend Reith placed himself near the bunting, as though afraid his recollection might displease. Miss Blythe adopted a posture so rigidly upright she seemed taller. Trevor positioned himself near the door, his nervous glances suggesting a desire to flee rather than reenact anything. Councillor Ede lingered at a convenient distance, clearly hoping his role would go unnoticed. Purbright approached the hall's clock, making a small performance of checking his watch. "I wonder," he said mildly, "if the time displayed here is entirely accurate. These clocks can drift, you know. Allow me." Without further explanation, and without haste, he reached up and adjusted the minute hand by precisely 8 minutes. A tiny sound escaped someone, too soft to identify. But Purbright noticed that Councillor Ide's posture faltered, his breath catching. Miss Blythe's eyes flicked sharply to the clock. Mr. Glegg shifted uneasily. Purbright stepped back. "There. Perhaps that reflects what the time appeared to be yesterday." Those words hung in the air with delicate intent. To most of the group, the adjustment meant nothing, but to someone who had relied upon the clock's discrepancy, either to construct an alibi or to conceal their own movements, the sudden correction struck with the force of a misplayed note in an otherwise familiar tune. Councillor Ede had gone pale. His eyes darted from the clock to Purbright, then away again. Purbright addressed the group with mild encouragement. "Now, if you each recall what you were doing when the ivy collapsed." The villagers began to speak hesitantly, overlapping a little, correcting each other politely. Their recollections were fragmentary but sincere, except for one voice that remained conspicuously absent. Purbright turned his attention gently toward Ide. "Councillor, I don't believe we've yet heard your account." Ide swallowed, adjusting his tie as though it had grown too tight. I was nearby, of course, ensuring the tent was properly staffed and observing the entries." Purbright nodded. "And the time? Do you recall it?" Ide hesitated. "Naturally. It must have been just after noon. The clock—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Yes? The clock?" Ide's gaze lifted unwillingly toward it. The hall's clock now showed a time that contradicted whatever memory he had intended to claim. And, more importantly, it contradicted the version he had likely rehearsed, based on the tower clock's earlier, falsely fast reading. For a moment, tension held the room in a quiet grasp. Miss Blythe blinked sharply, exchanging a glance with her sister. Reverend Reith fussed with his hymn sheets again. Trevor shuffled his feet. Ide, perspiring slightly, attempted a weak smile. "Well, I mean to say, one cannot rely entirely on clocks, can one?" Purbright responded gently, "Yet you seemed yesterday to rely on it quite fully." The councillor stiffened. "You can't seriously suspect—" "I suspect," Purbright said softly, that someone knew the clock would mislead anyone checking their timing, and I suspect that same someone was unsettled when it no longer did. Ide made a small, involuntary movement toward the door, then caught himself. Purbright continued, his tone as calm as ever. The letter was removed from police custody with some haste. A crushed ivy leaf was left in its place. Not a random gesture, I think. More a message, or perhaps a mistake. A low murmur passed through the room. Purbright stepped closer to the group, his expression almost sympathetic. All I have done, counsellor, is correct the clock, and in doing so, I seem to have disturbed you. Ide drew a sharp breath, eyes widening. This is absurd. But the protest lacked conviction. Everyone saw it. Purbright gave no hint of triumph, only quiet understanding. His gentle trap had sprung, not through accusation, but through time itself. The one truth Ide had attempted to bend, and now found turned back upon him. He let the silence extend, allowing the counsellor's discomfort to settle fully into the room's consciousness. The others shifted, absorbing what they had just witnessed, each person recalibrating their understanding of the mystery. Purbright clasped his hands lightly. I thank you all. Your cooperation has been most enlightening. The trap had been simple, subtle, and entirely polite, but in Ivy's end, politeness was often the most effective tool of all. The village had not yet fully stirred when Purbright invited Councillor Ide to tea at the small meeting room adjoining the police station. It was a pleasantly furnished space, decorated with quietly forgettable watercolours and a vase of flowers clearly selected for their inoffensiveness. There was no air of interrogation about it, only the promise of polite conversation, which in Purbright's hands was often more effective than the sternest questioning. Ide entered with a stiffness that suggested he had barely slept. He clutched his hat as though it might shield him from whatever truth awaited. Purbright greeted him with warm civility, poured tea with measured grace, and let silence draw itself comfortably around them before speaking. Yesterday was rather eventful, he began, as though discussing a minor mishap at a church picnic. Yes, Ide replied cautiously. The fete certainly produced surprises. Purbright nodded. And certain clarifications. I am grateful to you for attending the reenactment. It was very helpful. Ide's fingers tightened around his cup. Inspector, I hope you're not implying. Not implying, Purbright said gently, explaining. Ide's breath caught. Purbright saw the small tremor in his hand, the slight sheen on his brow. A man who expected the worst, but hoped, futilely, for a delay in hearing it. The difficulty with time, Purbright continued, is that people assume it behaves consistently, but clocks, especially village clocks, are creatures of habit rather than accuracy. You relied on the Institute clock yesterday. You relied on it again today. And when it was altered, only slightly, the alteration unsettled you. Ide's jaw tightened. I was surprised, nothing more. You caught me off guard. Purbright regarded him with a calm that seemed to soften the accusation. The letter was taken, and whoever took it did so quickly, perhaps impulsively. The crushed ivy leaf left behind was not the sort of flourish Mrs. Carline would offer, nor one any thief would plant unless pressed by panic. I had nothing to do with that leaf, Ide said sharply. No, Purbright agreed. You did not leave it, but you did fear the letter. Ide opened his mouth, closed it, and looked momentarily lost. Purbright continued, his tone unchanging, his manner almost sympathetic. The letter, as you know, was addressed to Arnold Peckham, the former council clerk, a man who handled records, budgets, approvals. A man whose handwriting Mrs. Shillaby recognized. A man who had concerns, misfiled things he told Miss Blythe's sister, concerns that made him inconvenient. Ide shook his head fiercely. That's nonsense. Peckham was a timid man. He never accused anyone of anything. Not allowed, Purbright said. But he wrote letters. Letters he did not send. Letters he hid. Perhaps because he feared the consequences of making them known. The counsellor stared into his tea, as though hoping it might reveal a path of escape. You think he wrote something about me? Not think, Purbright replied softly. I am certain. Ide's head lifted sharply. You never opened the letter. You told everyone that. That one, Purbright said. The one found in Mrs. Carline's ivy. But there were others. Mr. Peckham was meticulous, you see. He kept duplicates. One in a locked tin box. The same type of box Miss Blythe saw the man in the brown coat carrying. Ide's control faltered. A faint tremor ran through him. That box was stolen years ago. Misplaced, Purbright corrected. By someone who had reason to remove it from the council office. Someone who believed its contents harmless until yesterday, when an ivy collapsed and an envelope bearing Peckham's hand emerged in public. Ide looked stricken. I didn't know there was a duplicate. Few would have, Purbright said. But the man who stole the original letter from the fate table, he knew. He feared whatever Peckham had written enough to act rashly. The counsellor's breathing grew shallow. Purbright let silence stretch, not as pressure, but as invitation. Eventually, Ide whispered, It wasn't meant to harm anyone. It was a temporary adjustment, a simple reallocation of small funds to cover an urgent expense. I plan to correct it later. Purbright's voice remained gentle, but Peckham discovered it. Yes, Ide whispered. He asked me about discrepancies in the parish improvements budget. I told him it was a filing error. He was nervous enough to believe me. I thought... He swallowed. I thought that was the end of it. And then he died, Purbright said softly. Ide's face crumpled. A heart attack. Nothing to do with me. Perhaps, Purbright said. But after his death, someone found his hidden letter in the greenhouse office. Someone who realized its implications. Someone who feared it. Ide looked away. I didn't want anyone to see it. I thought if it disappeared, the matter would end quietly. I took it, destroyed it. I wanted no scandal. And the ivy? Purbright asked. That was an accident, Ide admitted, voice cracking. I moved several pots last night while looking for the letter's hiding place. I didn't realize one had been switched, or that another letter existed. When it fell at the fate, he shut his eyes. I thought everything would unravel. I panicked. Purbright allowed him a moment. Then, with calm finality, he said, The village does not need spectacle, counsellor. It needs truth. And the truth is simple. A small misconduct left to rot in darkness will grow, like ivy, into something much harder to contain. Ide lowered his head into his hands. What happens now? Purbright folded his hands gently. We proceed with civility. The matter will be addressed properly. No uproar. Ivy's end will not be shaken more than necessary, but the truth must be acknowledged. Ide nodded faintly, defeated yet oddly relieved. Purbright rose, signalling the conversation's end. Thank you for your honesty. It is never too late to step back into the light, though it may sting at first. And with that, the quiet truth of Ivy's end, long buried beneath soil and secrecy, finally surfaced into the clear, unwavering morning. The news of Councillor Ide's quiet confession did not travel through Ivy's end with the velocity of scandal, but rather with a slow, steady seep of something long suspected and finally confirmed. The village possessed a talent for adjusting its collective memory to accommodate new facts without disturbing old comforts. By mid-afternoon, several residents were already convinced they had always known something was amiss in the council accounts, though none could produce a single remark they had made to that effect beforehand. Mrs. Carline was the first to recover from the emotional tumult of the fete. She arrived at the green the following morning with a fresh plant, a modest geranium, chosen, she said, for its honest, uncomplicated nature. Her relief at being cleared was so genuine that even Mrs. Petal, who had privately suspected her of staging an operatic garden scheme, softened enough to offer a restrained apology, which in Ivy's End was the equivalent of a public embrace. Miss Blythe, meanwhile, behaved with a brisk dignity that suggested she would never again allow herself to be entangled, even indirectly, with the shadow of Arnold Peckham's secrets. Yet there was an unspoken tenderness in the way she paused by the Institute steps, as though remembering the man who had once tuned the choir's piano and spoken to her about misfiled documents with earnest, fragile concern. She never mentioned him aloud, but the softening of her features betrayed that she had begun, quietly and privately, to forgive him for dying before explaining everything. The beekeeper, Mr. Glegg, spent the morning rearranging his hives, muttering apologies to them, as though they too had suffered from the village's brief upheaval. Whether anyone had truly disturbed them the night before, the fate remained uncertain, though Purbright suspected Glegg's fears had been more about conscience than apiculture. Still, his honey stall returned to its usual place at the next market, and by the end of the week he was recounting the entire affair with the air of a man grateful not to have been entangled further. Trevor Blee, buoyed by Purbright's quiet thanks for his observations, walked about the village with a curious mixture of pride and shyness. He had, whether intentionally or not, played a small but meaningful role, and Ivy's End's younger residents treated him with something approaching respect. The older residents maintained their usual suspicion of adolescence, but conceded that Trevor had proved useful for once, which, in local terms, was high praise indeed. Reverend Reith resumed his pastoral duties with renewed energy, offering sermons on the virtues of honesty and the importance of attending to one's moral housekeeping before ivy creeps over the foundations. The congregation, recognizing themselves within the metaphor, received the message with polite solemnity and afterwards dissected it over tea as though it were directed at someone else entirely. As for Councillor Ide, he stepped down from his position with a statement so carefully worded that it might have been drafted by the ghost of Peckham himself. He cited stress, overwork, and a desire to prioritize the community's stability. Few pressed him for details, not out of kindness, but out of an instinctive desire to let sleeping scandals lie. Ivy's End valued harmony over accuracy, and Purbright suspected Ide would soon be remembered more for his overly ambitious compost than for his mishandling of council funds. By the end of the week, the fate's footprint had vanished entirely from the green. The grass stood untrampled, the bunting was folded into its box, and the Institute clock resumed its irregular habit of gaining minutes whenever unattended. Purbright considered mentioning this to someone, but ultimately decided against it. The village, he felt, required at least one benign inconsistency to remain itself. In his office at the station, he reviewed his notes with quiet satisfaction, not triumph, such a word had no place in his vocabulary, but a sense of gentle resolution. No grand villain had been unmasked, no thrilling conspiracy unravelled. Instead, The truth had emerged through small observations, hesitant recollections, and the delicate prodding of human conscience. It was, Purbright reflected, the sort of conclusion that suited Ivy's End perfectly, a tangle of modest failings, minor fears, and the quiet yearning to preserve reputation. He closed the file, placed it neatly among others, and reached for the paperwork that had been awaiting him long before the fate intervened. Forms to sign, letters to review, a report on stray dogs that seemed infinitely more complicated than necessary. Ordinary duties, undramatic and unhurried, the kind that anchored him far more firmly than any moment of revelation. Outside his window, the afternoon sun warmed the rooftops of Ivy's End, smoothing over the lines of the past days with serene indifference. A child ran past, chasing a rolling hoop. A bicycle bell chimed. A woman laughed softly as she greeted a neighbour. Life resumed its familiar choreography. Purbright allowed himself one final glance at the institute clock. It marked the hour inaccurately by nearly 5 minutes, having already drifted from the careful adjustment he had made. He smiled. Perfection, he knew, never lasted long in small towns, and sometimes that was for the best. He dipped his pen, turned to the next form, and resumed his quiet work, content, as always, to let the village settle back into its gentle, human untidiness.